Hey guys, back with another video, and today I figured it could be interesting to go over the possibility of whether Deacon is the Lone Wanderer or not. From a theory perspective, it's pretty interesting that the Lone Wanderer and Deacon could be the same person. However, I also think there is a lot of evidence that provides information that would indicate that both individuals are in fact not the same person. In this video, I'll go over some of the evidence that suggests that they could be the same person, and also go over some evidence that suggests that they aren't. I will then give you my opinion on the matter, as well as talk about how Deacon could still end up being the Lone Wanderer, though in a way that you might not expect. But I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and start. Now, there are a few pieces of evidence that are cited to prove that the Lone Wanderer and Deacon might be the exact same person. A significant portion of this evidence has to do with the fact that the Lone Wanderer appears to have had some ties with the railroad, thanks to some of his actions during the events of the Replicated Man side quest from Fallout 3. Feasibly, the Lone Wanderer is a morally upstanding individual and decides to go ahead and help Harkness maintain his identity and protect him from Dr. Zimmer and the Institute. The idea here is that because the Lone Wanderer decided to help protect the synth, the Railroad consider him to be more of an ally than most other people that you might encounter in the Wasteland. And as you will discover later on, the Railroad will attempt to recruit members that are seemingly sympathetic to their cause. Another important piece of evidence that seems to suggest that the Lone Wanderer and Deacon are the same person is based around some dialogue that Deacon will randomly say as you journey through the Capital Wasteland with him. Deacon seems to indicate that he has been to the Capital Wasteland during his travels when he says, quote, "I miss the Capital Wasteland. You can actually drink the water there." The idea here is that perhaps Deacon was in the Capital Wasteland when he was formerly known as the Lone Wanderer. Finally, it's also suggested that the reason that Deacon and the Lone Wanderer are the same person is that they would appear to be around the same age. In Fallout 3, the Lone Wanderer is around 19 years old, while in Fallout 4, the Lone Wanderer would be around 29 years old. And it's speculated by some in the community that Deacon looks like he is around 29 years old as well, and therefore Deacon and the Lone Wanderer might be the same person. With all of this said, I actually have quite a number of criticisms of a lot of this evidence. Let's start with the Lone Wanderer's connections to the Railroad. While it's likely that the Lone Wanderer helped Harkness during the events of Fallout 3, just because he has sympathies for synths doesn't necessarily make him a direct ally of the Railroad. After all, the Lone Wanderer ends up joining the Brotherhood of Steel, which is an organization that may have deviated from its original goals in Fallout 3, but on an organizational level is very much against the idea of synths. And this is especially the case in Fallout 4. And I would argue that because the Lone Wanderer joined the Brotherhood of Steel, the Railroad would view the Lone Wanderer as a possible enemy, or at the very least, someone that couldn't be trusted with extremely sensitive information. As for Deacon's remarks on going to the Capital Wasteland, there are many characters that have been to or are from the Capital Wasteland. For example, Dr. Lee came from the Capital Wastes, along with other characters like Elder Maxon and Robert McCready. The Children of Adam that appear in the Far Harbor DLC also appear to have been from the Capital Wasteland, which means key players like High Confessor Tectus and Grand Zealot Richter are from the region as well. My point is that going to the Capital Wasteland on its own isn't particularly special because there are so many people that are either from there or claim to have gone there. Now, with this said, Deacon's line that implies that he has been there is still important. However, it's only important because he indicates the canon ending for Fallout 3. After all, it's pretty nice to know that Project Purity was successful and is currently active in the Wasteland during the events of Fallout 4. It's also worth noting that just because the Lone Wanderer and Deacon might appear to be the same age at first glance, doesn't necessarily mean that the Lone Wanderer and Deacon are the same person. It's worth mentioning that Deacon has been able to change his appearance several times, and it's possible that Deacon could have looked entirely different 10 years ago than he currently does now. There are even reports from the Railroad that Deacon spent a month looking like a ghoul, and as you can see, it clearly says, quote, "I kicked Deacon out of HQ, got sick of the lying, face-changing son of a bitch. That month he spent as a ghoul freaked a lot of people out." And This is important to note because while Deacon may look like he's 29 during the events of the game, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is 29 years old. If there's anything you take away from what I just mentioned, it's the following. First, just because the Lone Wanderer and Deacon appear to look the same age doesn't mean that they are, especially since Deacon is well known for changing his face and taking on other people's identities. Second, while it does appear that Deacon has been to the capital Wasteland and his statements that, quote, you can actually drink the water there is important, the fact that he's been to the capital Wasteland in of itself isn't that important. After all, we've had several different NPCs like Maxon, McCready, Dr. Lee, High Confessor Tectus, and many others that claim to have gone or come from the capital Wasteland. The third and final thing is that while the Lone Wanderer does or may have sympathy for synths, his or her allegiances compromise their chances of being trusted by the Railroad completely. Perhaps he is an ally of some sort, but I doubt someone like Desdemona would entrust the Lone Wanderer with the location of their headquarters, knowing they have allegiance with one of their sworn enemies. Now, I'd like to go ahead and discuss much of the evidence that suggests that Deacon and the Lone Wanderer couldn't possibly be the same person. While it's worth noting that Deacon does have a tendency to lie, and it's reasonable to suggest that the story he tells about his early life isn't true, his early life story doesn't even remotely line up with that of the Lone Wanderers. Once you've achieved a significant amount of affinity with Deacon, he will tell you about his early life story, and here is that dialogue exchange.
Go on.
I ran with a gang in University Point. We called ourselves the UP Death Claws. For kicks, we'd terrorize anyone we thought was a synth. We kept egging each other on. Started with some property damage, graduated to some beatdowns, then, inevitably, a lynching. The Claw's leader was convinced we'd finally found and killed the synth. Looking back, I'm not so sure.
I'll withhold judgment until you finish.
Thanks. So I turned my back on my brothers, broke all contact. Time passed, I became a farmer, if you can believe that. Then, one day I found someone. She saw something in me I didn't know was there. Barbara, well, she just was.
Leaving the Death Claws took a lot of courage.
Leaving wasn't free. They took it out on my sad hide. But by the time I met Barbara, they'd moved on. We were trying for kids, eking out a living. Then one day, it turns out my Barbara, she was a synth. She didn't know that. I certainly didn't. I don't know how the Death Claws found out, but there was blood.
Shit. I'm sorry.
I don't remember much clearly after that. I know I killed most of the Claws. I must have made a big impression. The Railroad contacted me figuring I'd be sympathetic, seeing that I lost my wife. And, well, what I did afterwards.
This story, if true, would be an indicator that Deacon is actually from the Commonwealth. While Deacon does have a reputation for being a liar, I do think that on some level there are probably elements of the truth within Deacon's lies. Perhaps he wasn't a member of the UP Deathclaws specifically, but it might be true that he was in a gang that once hated synths. It's also possible that he fell in love with the synth, just not a synth named Barbara. Either way, the next thing I will discuss basically confirms that Deacon isn't the Lone Wanderer. If you check the terminals at the Railroad's headquarters, there are at least 3 terminal entries that mention Deacon before 2277, which is the year that the Lone Wanderer left Vault 101 and the events of Fallout 3 take place. The first entry is dated to 2273 and discusses how Deacon was able to successfully evacuate a previous railroad headquarters. Another is dated to 2275, in which it's mentioned that Deacon was kicked out of the railroad headquarters. And finally, Deacon is mentioned again in 2276, when he is compared to Desdemona and Carrington. There's also the possibility that Deacon may also be the mysterious Johnny D that appears in terminal entries that are dated even earlier. While this is Desdemona's theory, if it holds true, then Deacon would have been a member of the Railroad since at least 2266, which would have been 11 years before the events of Fallout 3. All of this would seem to suggest that Deacon has been operating out in the Wasteland before the Lone Wanderer even left Vault 101, and because of that, Deacon and the Lone Wanderer couldn't possibly be the same person. While I think it's fairly conclusive that Deacon and the Lone Wanderer aren't the same person, I do think it would be possible for Deacon to become the Lone Wanderer, or at the very least, be able to impersonate the Lone Wanderer's looks. As we've established, Deacon is a face changer, and it's possible that he could change his face to look more like the Lone Wanderer's. The only reason I could think of that Deacon would want to emulate the Lone Wanderer would be to gain some kind of intelligence from the Brotherhood of Steel. Still, it might be difficult for Deacon to pass as the Lone Wanderer, especially since Deacon may not be able to change his voice to emulate the Lone Wanderer's. Though, if Deacon is able to change his voice to emulate anyone, he could literally be anyone he wants. Even if he can't mimic any man perfectly, Deacon does appear to be convincing enough to appear as anyone from a specific distance. And throughout the beginning stages of the game, he is good enough to where he can blend in and observe the player without you noticing. Of course, you're probably wondering, if Deacon isn't the Lone Wanderer, then who is he? Well, if you ask me, I would have to agree that Desdemona's probably right, and Deacon is most likely the mysterious John D that is mentioned in some of the Railroad's terminal entries. Though I would go a little bit further and argue that John D, much like the name Deacon, is another alias that stands for John Doe. So on some level, we're never really going to know who Deacon truly is, especially when you consider that Deacon lies all the time, changes his face, and most people that knew what he once looked like are probably dead. In my mind, Deacon is the perfect spy because Deacon can arguably be anyone and no one. He changes his face as a means to conceal what he truly is, and even his own allies aren't entirely sure who he is. For all they know, he could be the same John D that's been a member of the Railroad long before people like Desdemona showed up and decided to lead the organization. Or perhaps he's not John D and he did end up joining the Railroad in 2273, like those Railroad terminal entries seem to suggest. In a way, it doesn't really matter who he is. After all, even if he told the truth, most people would probably think he's lying by this point, and there's also a good chance that anyone in the Railroad that knew who he was during the 2260s and early 2270s is probably dead by this point. At the end of the day, Deacon might be the Lone Wanderer if he decides to impersonate them, though Deacon couldn't possibly be the same person that left Vault 101 and helped restore Project Purity. After all, the person that goes by Deacon appears to have been in the Commonwealth around the early 2270s, and even as early as the 2260s. So is Deacon the Lone Wanderer? Only if he wants to be. But is the Lone Wanderer Deacon? No. But alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you like this video, feel free to leave a like, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, take care, and I'll see y'all next time.